You're watching In Focus. Now, this month of August represents the 4th year anniversary of the brutal assault on the unarmed demonstrators who were responding to the military coup in Egypt of the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, whose reinstatement they were demanding. There were catalogues of abuses conducted by the state security forces on that day and in the weeks and days preceding and which followed, which Human Rights Watch has described as crimes against humanity. Now, these include the use of lethal force by the police and security forces to disperse thousands of unarmed protesters who had been involved in the sit-ins at the Rabaa and the Al-Nada mosques in Cairo. Whilst the number of those killed seems to vary, according to Human Rights Watch, at least over 1,150 people were killed in 5 separate incidents, and other reports suggest this number exceeds 2,000. Now, a press conference was held last weekend in London to highlight the injustices and the crimes committed at this time 4 years ago, which my studio guest today, Dr. Maha Azzam, president of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, the ERC, addressed those gathered. The ERC was established in August 2014 with a mandate to, and I quote, oppose all aspects of corruption and dictatorship in Egypt. They opposed the military coup and all that has ensued from it, and they refused to interfere. They refused the interference of the military in political life. We believe, they say, in constitutional legitimacy and work for the establishment of a civil state that reflects the will of the Egyptian people and their freedom in choosing their own government. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Azzam, and welcome again to In Focus.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you.
Now, before we go into the issue of the events at the Rabaa and the Al-Nada Square massacres on that fateful day, I'd like you to address something, if you may, on the legitimacy of the Sisi government, which is, as some argued, came on the back of the discontentment of Mohamed Morsi's presidency by the very people who led the revolution. And the fact as well that Sisi apparently won with an apparent 96% majority. Can it be regarded, the election, as a legitimate process?
What happened on the 3rd of July 2013 was a military coup. Essentially, a legitimately elected government that came to power through free and fair elections in 2012. The government of President Mohamed Morsi was overthrown less than a year later by General Sisi and the military in Egypt. Their excuse was that there were protests on the 30th of June against President Morsi, and that those protests, street protests, reflected the will of the Egyptian people for change, and therefore the military intervened. This is a classic story that we hear from the military throughout the world when they carry out a coup. They say they are coming in to either reflect the will of the people or protect the people. The people of Egypt chose their leader in 2012, the first civilian president of Egypt, through elections that were recognized by the world as free and fair. The military refused that new order that promised Egypt democracy and freedom, and for the first time in Egypt's history, that year of 2012, Egyptians saw more freedom and more respect for the rule of law than they ever had before. Over 60 years of military rule were interrupted in 2012 by the election of a civilian leader, Dr. Mohamed Morsi. The military and the elite, the corrupt elite of Egypt, could not tolerate that.
But some would argue that Sisi, for all his faults, held another election at which the population were invited to go to the ballot box, and they returned him with a 96% majority. So does that not give him some legitimacy at least then?
I think we need to remember that those elections were held in an atmosphere where there was no freedom for those to participate, where you had the elected members of parliament in prison, the elected president in prison, thousands of political prisoners, the leading political party, the Freedom and Justice Party, not participating, and its members in prison. There was no freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, and the electorate that decided to come out were minuscule. Essentially, people opted for not engaging in those elections because they knew they were happening under the repression of the military state that allowed no freedom. This was not an environment in which participants could partake through participation in the media, where they could rally supporters, and in any case it would have been illegitimate because it was being held under a new military order that had overthrown the legitimately elected presidency.
Well, thank you very much for that clarity. Now let's move on to the main reason for your press conference just last week. Can you give our viewers perhaps some sort of background as to the circumstances leading to the events in Rabaa Square and at the Al-Nada Square? Perhaps clarifying even the numbers, because we've got some varying figures, some saying 1,150. I know initially the government were denying most of these numbers and talked about 87 people. Then there were talks of over 2,000. What is the exact implication?
In a sense, Rabaa is very much a follow-up to that military coup. It was the refusal of thousands of Egyptians, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, who came together in a peaceful sit-in in Rabaa Square to say no peacefully to this military takeover. They said, we want our president back, we want our democracy back. And they proceeded through the heat of the month of August in 2013 to protest peacefully. They came with their families, men, women and children from all walks of life, from different political ideologies and orientations, came and sat in Rabaa Square and said, we're not moving until we have our democracy back. Essentially, this became, for the first time in some ways in Egypt's modern history, a mass peaceful protest that expressed the will of the people against the military regime. The military regime could not tolerate it. They ensued to think of different ways in order to disturb this protest, to make sure that the protesters went home. They refused to go home. And at the highest levels of the military regime in Egypt and of the government then of Adli Mansour, there was a calculated and systematic plan to enter the Rabaa Square and to ensure the dispersal of the sit-in through violence.
Now, you talk about a concerted plan to force the dispersal. Even Human Rights Watch's report, which is controversially attacking the Sisi regime for abuses, but it does make the point that, and I'm going to quote them, international legal standards allow the intentional use of lethal force in policing situations in limited circumstances where they're strictly necessary to protect life. So they make that point, but they do go on to say that the use of lethal force was a result of attempts to resist dispersals imposed by the security forces. There were some barricades built at various entrances to the square. There were some throwing of Molotov cocktails. That's been reported. There were some fireworks hurled. And according to the Interior Minister, Mohammed Ibrahim, at the time, he said that the security forces responded to gunfire. So is there any truth, even if it's in isolated places, that there was some sort of lethal force being used by protesters?
The Ministry of Interior and the security forces of General Sisi were the ones who entered with force. They acted with impunity against unarmed civilians. If there is any record of a Molotov cocktail, this would have happened after the attack, and helicopters flying over Rabaa Square attacking the protesters, where exits to Rabaa Square were blocked so people could not escape, where bodies were set on fire, where the tanks entered the square. We have records, whether video records, recordings, pictures, eyewitness reports of the fact that these innocent, unarmed civilians were being mowed down by the security forces and their bodies burned. Even the Rabaa hospital, and we have again eyewitness reports from doctors saying that they were not able to treat the wounded, and some of the wounded were shot directly by the security forces. Human Rights Watch does go on to say that what happened at Rabaa Square may well amount to crimes against humanity.
Indeed. Now, I've heard in this studio from individuals who were in attendance at the sit-ins on the very day the security forces began their assault. They suggested the whole process was systemic, that snipers were positioned on the rooftops surrounding the squares, on the mosques, and shooting started more or less from the moment they arrived at the camps without any provocation, and indiscriminately, even against those who had elected to leave by the so-called safe entrances being announced on megaphones by the security forces. Now, I have to say, it sounds a little like a killing scene from a Nazi concentration camp. Is that how you see it?
I see it as a shoot-to-kill policy. I see it in terms of the evidence we have that men and women and young women were shot in the back or in the chest or in the head. I see it as an attempt by this regime to ensure that the Egyptian people don't dare ever stand up to the military regime, and that of course has not happened. Rabaa was not the only massacre. Egyptians resisted in Nahda, they resisted throughout Egypt. The first massacre was that happened also was while Egyptians were in prayer in front of the guards where President Morsi was being held, and again they were shot during prayer during the Fajr prayer. The regime from day one was out to kill Egyptians that were opposed to this military regime if they dared to resist. And this policy continues today. Egypt's prisons have over 60,000, at the lowest estimate, of so-called political prisoners. Some of those people were just picked up randomly, and they don't even have a political affiliation.
So what's been the national and the international legal position adopted, especially by the Egyptian authorities, in respect of these alleged crimes against humanity? I mean, they would have seen the Human Rights Watch report. Has anybody been held to account, held responsible for the crimes against humanity committed? Has there been any state or independent investigation other than the human rights organisations' reports?
No one has been held to account. What has happened with impunity. Those responsible for what happened in Rabaa are not just the security forces. The order came from the highest level of the state, the head at the time, General Sisi. And again, the report, Human Rights Watch, these are not my words, but Human Rights Watch says very clearly that this was authorized at the highest level of state. Therefore, what we have before us as an international community, not only for the Egyptian people, but in terms of the international community, is a regime in power that has committed massacres, not one massacre, Rabaa being the worst in the sense that it was the worst massacre in the modern history of Egypt, because we saw the death of so many in a number of hours, in a matter of 12 hours.
To put this in perspective, if you we all have heard about the massacre in Tiananmen Square, and that's etched on most of our memories. There were there were 700 to 800 people killed then. We are talking about upwards of 2,000 people in one afternoon at Rabaa and Al-Nada, and then you've made reference to some other massacres that took place just before and after. You have the July the 5th outside the Republican Guard headquarters, where the people thought President Morsi was being held. There were 5 people were killed. 61 people were killed outside the same headquarters a few days later. On the July 27th, 95 people who took part in a protest march against the new Sisi-imposed mandate to fight terrorism was shot and killed. 2 days following that, 120 protesters. We're talking about hundreds of people being mowed down by armed police. So what... is there any sort of legal redress? At the moment, there's been nothing.
There's been nothing. There was an attempt to take the case to the International Criminal Court, but because Egypt is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, the prosecutor did not take this up. That doesn't mean that the regime in Egypt is not guilty of a crime. As we know in other cases throughout the world, crimes against humanity can be resurrected. They are not in front of the International Criminal Court.
Just to get this clear, now the legal case taken to the International Criminal Court, actually it was the Mohammed Morsi's Freedom and Justice Party were represented by a London-based law firm, fell down on the fact, as you mentioned, that Egypt was not a signing party to the ICC. But to all intents and purposes, the Morsi administration was declaring that it was prepared to be a signatory to this, but the ICC must have made a judgment that they could no longer be, and therefore, by default, were endorsing Sisi as the effective president of Egypt. Would that be a fair analysis?
It's a fair analysis insofar as the international community, unfortunately, did not continue to recognize President Morsi as the elected leader of Egypt and came to recognize Sisi and the coup. And that in itself was a political decision taken, as I said, unfortunately, by democratic governments. But that is not to say that cannot be reversed, and that the Egyptian people will continue to pursue the military regime in Egypt and hold it accountable for the death of Egyptians that happen not only in Rabaa, but continue to happen on a regular basis. The shooting of protesters, the shooting of innocent people, the torture and the slow death of those imprisoned. The military regime in Egypt will be held accountable, either in front of the International Criminal Court one day or in Egypt itself.
Now, you have been through a number of breaches of international law that are put at the feet of the Sisi regime. But there's one case that struck me as being particularly horrendous, and I just wanted to raise this with you. It was the, if you like, the arrest of 45 protesters who were apparently crammed into a police vehicle that was designed to host not more than about 22 people. They were manacled, so they were handcuffed in pairs, squashed into this vehicle, and a tear gas canister thrown in. The majority of them died. 37 people out of the 45 died. It sounds like, again, something from the Second World War, some of the cruelest crimes that you can imagine. Can you explain the circumstances and whether there was any particular attention on that issue, any actions taken?
Again, the crime and it was a crime and remains a crime, happened with the knowledge of the military regime in Egypt, and there has been no accountability. And whenever there
were some arrests and some indictments, were there?
Some but very short-lived and not at the higher echelons of the state. Even those directly responsible have free rein. It is a known fact that the regime, the military regime of Egypt, has told the police force and the security that they will not be held accountable for any infringements, in quotes, on the law that may be carried out. Therefore, they are assured of the support and loyalty of those that commit these crimes in the security forces. I think the main thing to remember is what you described in terms of those numbers dying in the van, is that it is reminiscent of things we've heard, horrific acts during the Second World War, but we know full well that those criminals and that crime did not, is never erased, however long it takes. And I think that is something to remind our viewers that the Egyptian people will not forget. And the fact that the international community ignores what has happened and continues to deal with General Sisi doesn't mean he's any less of a criminal.
He was invited to the UK, and one used to think that the laws of universal jurisdiction and the Act on our own statute books, which is the Geneva Convention Act, would force us to bring him to account in our courts for some of these crimes. Why has that not happened?
And that remains a possibility and a channel which we mustn't ignore. Universal jurisdiction, and that is also being pursued now as regards Assad through a particular law firm, I believe Guernica in Spain. There is no reason why that international jurisdiction should not be applied to the Sisi regime.
Now, the Muslim Brotherhood has issued a press release on the anniversary of the massacre, in which they claim that the rule of law in Egypt is at an end, that the judiciary, as it stands, is there to serve just the interests of the current regime and to cover up reprehensible crimes. The press release pledges to, and I quote, remain on the path committed to democratic legitimacy, to go on until the revolution triumphs, retribution is delivered and the people's rights are restored. Isn't it true to say that the effective international acceptance of the branding of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation by Sisi, and that's been accepted? Saudi and other Arab states have endorsed this and attempted themselves to brand it, and the seizing of its assets. Hasn't it not rendered the Muslim Brotherhood somewhat impotent in this struggle?
The Muslim Brotherhood has not been branded as a terrorist organisation in the West. It has not been branded as such in the United Kingdom or the United States. That is the branding of authoritarian states. It's the branding that General Sisi has given to the Brotherhood, and the allies of General Sisi have given, the allies in the region, the Gulf states. The Muslim Brotherhood is an organisation that did not resort to violence, opposes violence, and continues to stress peaceful opposition. It has not become impotent. On the contrary, I believe the Egyptian public as a whole now, even those that may have had certain question marks over Dr. Morsi and his election, now realize that the military regime of Egypt is a danger to the country as a whole. It's a danger to civil rights. It's a danger to the most basic of freedoms. It uses the legal, the justice system as a branch of the military regime. It controls the media. It imprisons the young. That the military regime has been responsible ultimately for Egypt's deterioration economically and in terms of security. And therefore, I believe that despite the factor of fear that the Egyptian regime continues to ensure predominates that there is a ever-growing opposition to the regime in Egypt, and it's not going to stop. And all it needs is a very small spark that will then ignite, I believe, the second wave of the Egyptian revolution.
So you think that the call, for example, by the anti-coup pro-legitimacy National Alliance for a new revolutionary week under Rabaa Massacre continues? You think that despite the severe, probably some of the most severe economic problems facing Egypt, rising inflation, food shortages, coupled with, as you said, the fear that they're experiencing from the harsh clampdown of Sisi, do you still believe that the Egyptian people have got the will to resist the excesses of the current regime? Or is it reasonable to say that the restoration of democracy in Egypt in the short term is going to be something of a dream?
The barrier of fear will break. And we know that all authoritarian regimes survive because they instill fear in their populations. We saw recently a 2-week strike by workers in Mahalla. Workers' strikes throughout Egypt over the last 6 years before the military coup helped ignite the January 25th revolution. I believe, given the economic situation, those strikes will not go away. The majority of Egyptians are angry, they are poor, and they reject the military regime as never before. 60 years of military rule has brought nothing to the country, nothing in terms of development, whether in terms of education or health or housing. There is great corruption in that country. Egyptians seek a better future, and I think that search for a better future will see the light of day. Egyptians will take to the streets again in order to bring down the military regime. The barrier of fear is strong, but it will weaken over time because the condition of Egypt is such that there is no alternative except ending the military regime.
But with that optimistic prediction, Dr. Maha Azzam, President of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, it's been a real pleasure and an honour. Thank you for joining me on Islam Channel.
Thank you very much.